What do you do when the only things that truly belong to you are the clothes on your back, a tired dog at your side, and a story nobody would ever believe? The question followed Ethan through the gray mornings and long evenings of the town, hanging behind him like his own shadow. At 15, he had learned that people looked right through you if you walked with your head down and your hands busy. So that was how he moved now. Eyes on the pavement, fingers worrying the frayed strap of his backpack, the dog's paws patting softly beside him. The dog's name was Rust, not because of his color, though his coat was a muddled reddish-brown, but because he was what Ethan imagined Rust felt like, stubborn, clinging, refusing to let go even when the world tried to scrape him off. They slept where they could, under church steps when the weather was kind, behind the dumpy laundromat when the wind cut too sharply through the alleys, in the hollow belly of an abandoned van when the rain turned cold and mean. Ethan knew which dumpsters had food that wouldn't make Rust sick, which store owners would look the other way if the boy lingered near the warm air vent after closing. He knew the sound of tires that meant trouble, and the sound of footsteps that meant he should pretend not to exist. He also knew the field. It lay just beyond the edge of town, where houses thinned and fences gave up, where the land dipped gently between a row of old cottonwoods and a rusted barbed wire line that once meant something to somebody. The field belonged no one now, or to everyone, depending on how you looked at it. Weeds grew waist-high in summer. In autumn, they browned and rattled like 1,000 paper tongues whispering secrets. At its far end, leaning toward collapse, stood the remains of a small shed and what might once have been a chicken coop. Ethan went there when the town felt too tight around his chest, when the pitying looks or the cold stares got into his bones. Out there, he could see the sky without wires crossing it, hear the wind instead of engines. Rust liked it too. The dog raced through the tall grass with a kind of wild, quiet joy, as if he remembered a life before parking lots and alleyways. That day had started like any other gray November afternoon. The clouds sat low, pressing the light flat over everything, turning the town into a faded photograph. Ethan's stomach ached with the dull, familiar hollowness that meant he'd eaten breakfast yesterday, and nothing since. He'd done his usual circuit behind the grocery store. No luck, just coffee grounds and broken jars. The woman at the diner had slipped him a biscuit when the manager wasn't looking, but it hadn't been much. Rust had gotten half without argument. Watching the dog lick the crumbs from his palm was the only moment that felt close to full. By late afternoon, the sidewalks were slick with an almost rain, that damp mist that never quite committed to falling. People hurried past with collars upturned, eyes on their own front doors waiting somewhere ahead. Ethan felt the edges of the town tightening around him again. He whistled low, and Rust appeared from behind a trash bin, tail wagging just once as if to ask, "Where now?" Ethan tugged his backpack higher and tipped his chin toward the road out of town. "Come on," he murmured. "Let's get out where it's quiet." The walk to the field took longer than usual. The damp cold crept into his jeans and through his shoes, numbing his toes. Rust kept close, occasionally bumping his head against Ethan's hand as if to check that the boy was still there. Cars hissed past on wet asphalt, their headlights smeared by the mist. By the time they stepped off the cracked sidewalk and onto the dirt track leading toward the cottonwoods, Ethan's breath came out in faint white puffs. The field opened in front of them, wide and unbothered, as if the town had never existed. Grass, dulled to a winter yellow, shimmered under the thin sheen of moisture. The cottonwoods stood like tired sentries along the edge, branches bare, their bark darkened by damp. Beyond them, the mountains were just faint shapes, washed out blue in the distance. Ethan felt his shoulders loosen a little. Out here, nobody asked him where his parents were, or why he wasn't in school, or how long he'd been sleeping rough. The field didn't care. It accepted his footsteps the same way it accepted the wind and the rustling of birds. Rust bounded ahead, plunging into the grass with bright eyes, nose low to the ground. Ethan watched him for a moment, something like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, then headed toward the old shed. The structure leaned hard to one side, as if it had grown tired of standing upright years ago. Boards gaped between the slats, and its roof was patchy, but it still offered some shelter when the weather turned. Ethan had swept out a corner weeks ago, pushing aside broken tools and old feed sacks, lining the space with cardboard he'd scavenged from a store dumpster. It wasn't much, but it kept his back out of the wind. He ducked inside now, setting his backpack down and listening to its familiar clink of whatever odds and ends he carried. An extra pair of socks, a chipped mug, the folded photograph he never unfolded anymore. Rust followed, then paused, ears suddenly sharp, nose testing the air. The dog's body went still in that way that made Ethan's own muscles tighten. Life on the streets had taught him to trust Rust's instincts long before he trusted his own. "What is it?" Ethan whispered. Rust ignored him, turning away from the shed opening toward the far side of the field, the side he usually avoided because the ground dipped there and collected water, turning the grass into a muddy tangle. The dog whined once, low, then trotted out into the open, head up, tail lowered, but not tucked. Ethan frowned. The last thing he needed was Rust chasing after a raccoon or a skunk and getting hurt. "Hey, leave it," he called softly, following. The wind picked up, tugging at his jacket. The damp mist thickened into a light drizzle, leaving tiny beads of water on Rust's back. Ethan shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, fingers brushing the smooth, cool edges of the few coins he had left. The ground toward the dip was softer than he remembered, the mud clinging to his shoes, making sucking sounds as he moved. Rust reached the low spot first and stopped so abruptly that Ethan almost walked into him. The dog's nose was inches from the ground, paws planted on either side of a shallow depression in the earth. Ethan leaned over his shoulder. At first, he thought he was looking at rocks. 3 round shapes nestled together in a patch of flattened grass, damp earth molded around their lower halves. But rocks didn't have that smooth, dull sheen. Rocks didn't catch what little light there was and hold it, like something breathing just under the surface. "No way," he whispered. Eggs. Big ones. Bigger than any chicken egg he'd ever seen, almost the size of his fists, their shells a strange pale color that wasn't quite white, with faint mottling that seemed to shift when he moved his head. Rust sniffed again, then pulled back, ears flattening for a heartbeat before settling. He wasn't afraid exactly, but cautious. Ethan crouched slowly, the chill from the wet ground, seeping through his jeans. He extended a hesitant hand over the nearest egg, not quite touching it at first. Steam from his breath wavered over the smooth shell. Finally, his fingers made contact. The egg was warm, not just from the earth. Actively warm, like something alive curled tight inside. Ethan's heart kicked once, hard. He glanced around automatically, as if expecting to see someone watching from the edge of the field. There was no one, just the empty road, the relentless drizzle, the distant smear of town. He didn't see any tracks nearby beyond rusted fence posts and the faint prints of small animals. No nest, no feathers, no sign of a bird large enough to lay something like this. "You've got to be kidding me," he murmured. His first thought was that they belonged to some kind of farm bird. Maybe someone's turkeys had escaped. Maybe a strange breed he hadn't seen before. But that didn't feel right. The eggs looked wrong in a way he couldn't explain. Not broken or sick, just out of place, like they'd been dropped here from some other story that had nothing to do with grocery store dumpsters and abandoned vans. Rust whined softly and nudged Ethan's shoulder with his nose, as if reminding him that hesitation was rarely a good idea out here. "Yeah, I know," Ethan said. "But what am I supposed to do? Leave them?" They sat there, perfect and unprotected in the shallow indentation, the drizzle rolling off their curved shells in tiny beads. If the rain turned heavier, if the temperature dropped tonight, if some scavenger sniffed them out, they wouldn't last. He told himself he didn't care. They weren't his problem. He could turn around, go back to the shed, curl up with Rust, and ride out the night like any other. But as he stared at the eggs, something fragile and stubborn rose in his chest. He remembered a different room, warmer years ago, when someone had put a box of puppies in front of a much smaller version of him and said, "Be gentle, Ethan. They're not ready for this world yet." He remembered how carefully he touched them, one finger at a time. He remembered his mother's face then, softer than it ever was later. That life was gone. The house, the dogs, his mother, the warm rooms, all swept away in a flood of arguments, bills, and finally, the silence of a hospital corridor. But the feeling was here again now, unexpected and unwelcome. The sense that something, anything, needed him. He sighed, the sound turning into a cloud in the cold air. "We can't just leave them," he muttered. Rust wagged his tail once, as if he'd been waiting for Ethan to catch up. Moving slowly, almost reverently, Ethan slid his hands under the nearest egg. The warmth deepened against his skin, surprising him. It felt like holding a small animal, a kitten, maybe, or a bird with its wings folded tight. The shell was smooth, but thicker than a chicken's, resisting his fingers with a faint, stubborn strength. He lifted it carefully, cradling it against his chest. "Okay," he whispered to whatever lay inside. "Don't break on me." One by one, he moved the eggs, making 3 trips between the shallow dip and the shed. Rust trotted beside him every time, glancing up as if counting, as if ensuring none were dropped, lost, or forgotten. Inside the shed, in the cleared corner where his cardboard bedding lay, Ethan folded his thin blanket in half and arranged it into a kind of nest. He set the eggs on it gently, leaving a bit of space between each, then wrapped the sides up around them as best he could, forming a rough cradle of fabric and warmth. The shed was dim, the single broken window letting in only a weak smear of gray light. Ethan could smell damp wood and old straw, the faint ghosts of animals that had lived here long before. The eggs gleamed softly in the gloom, as if they held their own shy light. "Well," he said, quietly, sinking back on his heels, "this is insane." Rust settled down near the doorway, front paws stretched in front of him, head resting on them, eyes trained on the blanket. It was the same look he'd had the night Ethan first found him behind the supermarket, when the dog had watched every movement with a mix of suspicion and hope. "Don't start guarding them like they're yours," Ethan muttered. "We don't even know what they are." But his voice lacked conviction, and Rust, perhaps sensing that, merely blinked slowly. Evening crept in. The drizzle outside deepened into real rain, drumming softly on the patchy roof. Cold air slipped through the cracks, curling around Ethan's ankles, but the corner where the eggs lay remained surprisingly warm. He moved closer, drawn by a pull he didn't want to name, and pressed his palm lightly against one shell. The warmth met him again, steady as a heartbeat. Or maybe that was his own pulse, echoing in his fingers. Time blurred in the shed. Rain, breath, the sound of Rust's quiet, snuffling sleep. Ethan's thoughts drifted in loops. He tried to tell himself practical stories, that they were turkey eggs or some exotic farm bird, that he would wake up tomorrow and find them unchanged, just odd treasures tucked away in his strange, lonely corner of the world. But another part of his mind whispered questions he didn't want to ask. Why here? Why unguarded? Why so warm? Why did they make the hair on his arms stand up, not in fear, but in some strange anticipation, like standing in the dark, listening for a train, long before you heard the tracks sing? At some point, the gray light outside thinned almost to nothing. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter around him and lay down beside the blanket, curling his body in a protective curve without meaning to. Rust shifted closer, pressing his back against Ethan's chest, sharing their small heat. The eggs lay between boy and dog, three pale shapes breathing their silent warmth into the cold shed. "If you hatch into something that bites," Ethan murmured, eyes growing heavy, "I swear, I'm putting you back in the field." But even as he said the words, he knew he wouldn't. Sleep came in shallow pools. He drifted up and down through them, surfacing every time the rain changed tempo or Rust twitched in a dream. In one fragile, not quite dream, he imagined he heard a faint tapping sound, like a distant neighbor knocking politely on a wall. He stirred, eyes opening to darkness, listening. The shed creaked. The rain sighed. Rust shifted. Silence folded over everything again. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe hunger and tired bones could make you hear anything. He closed his eyes. The next time he woke, it was to a different sound entirely. The thin, uncertain trill of birds in the cottonwoods, the faint hum of the road, the peculiar stillness that meant the rain had passed. Light seeped through the cracks, this time clearer, washed clean. Ethan blinked, throat dry, and rolled onto his back. For a heartbeat, he forgot where he was. Then the smell of old straw and damp wood brought it all back, and he turned his head toward the blanket. 3 eggs. Still there. Still whole. But different somehow. The modeling on their shells seemed darker now, patterns like fine cracks of light and shadow. And when he leaned close, he knew, instantly, that the warmth coming off them had changed. It was no longer that quiet, sleeping heat. It pulsed, faint, rhythmic, like 3 small hearts, learning how to keep time with a world they hadn't seen yet. Rust was already awake, head up, ears forward, watching the eggs with an intentness Ethan had only seen before when the dog tracked something alive. The boy swallowed, his own heart stumbling into a faster beat. "Okay," he whispered to the shed, to the dog, to the impossible shapes on the blanket. "Whatever you are, you're not going to stay quiet for long, are you?" He felt the answer rather than heard it. A faint tremor under his palm when he reached out again, as if something inside one of the shells had shifted closer to the surface at the sound of his voice. The field outside waited, ordinary and gray. The town beyond it, waking to another day of coffee and traffic and gossip that never reached as far as this forgotten patch of land. No one out there knew that in a broken shed on the edge of everything, a homeless boy and his stray dog were watching 3 strange eggs, and that the world, at least their small, rough corner of it, was quietly changing as they did. Ethan didn't move for a long moment, his palm hovering just a breath above the eggs, as if the slightest touch might break whatever fragile balance held them together. Rust crept closer on his belly, tail low, eyes fixed on the blanket with the wary fascination of an animal who knows something is alive but can't yet decide if it's prey, threat, or something in between. The shed felt small, tighter than it had the night before, as if the walls were leaning in, trying to listen. Outside, the faint morning wind rustled the wet grass. A crow called once from the cottonwoods and then fell silent, as though it had seen something it didn't trust. Ethan finally let out a slow breath which seemed to loosen the world around him. He pushed himself upright, joints stiff from the cold ground, and brushed damp straw from his jacket. He felt older than he was, the kind of tired that came not from sleep, but from life itself. But as he looked at the eggs, that heaviness wavered. They had changed overnight. He wasn't imagining that. The mottled patterns had become clearer, almost purposeful, swirling like smoke frozen under a thin shell. One of the eggs trembled gently, just once, a movement so delicate he thought at first it was the blanket shifting. But Rust snarled under his breath, soft, uncertain, and Ethan knew he hadn't imagined anything. "All right," he murmured, rubbing his thumb across the shell. "You're waking up." He didn't know what to do. There was no book, no guide, no adult leaning down to explain what kind of creature grew warm in the night and pushed at its own shell by morning. He only had guesses, none of which made sense. He checked the shed doorway, half expecting to see someone there, some farmer ready to shout that he'd stolen something rare and valuable. But the field remained empty. Just the muted shape of the town in the distance, and a ribbon of road that didn't belong to him. He turned back to the eggs, pulse tugging faster in his neck. "We have maybe half a day," he said quietly. "Maybe less." Rust puffed out a small huff, as if agreeing. Ethan didn't know why he spoke aloud. Maybe because he needed to hear the sound of another voice, something to anchor him. He stood and crossed the shed to his backpack, digging through it with cold fingers. He didn't have much, but he had an idea. A bad one, a risky one. But it was all he had. He pulled out his jacket, a thin, patched thing he'd found weeks ago, and laid it beside the blanket. If the eggs hatched today, they'd need warmth. They'd need softness. More than anything, they'd need someone willing to care. Ethan snorted under his breath. "Lucky you found me," he muttered. "World's least qualified parent." Rust shot him a look that for a dog felt dangerously close to judgment. He checked the eggs again. The smallest one, a slightly paler shape, quivered like something inside was pushing at the shell with timid, testing motions. Ethan's breath caught. The moment was coming faster than he'd thought. Okay, he whispered, as if talking to the egg itself. "Just wait. I need to get you water. Something warm. Just wait." He grabbed his backpack and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to sting his cheeks, and the sky wore that dull winter gray tone that made everything feel farther away. The field stretched open in every direction, a muted, yellow expanse where nothing important had happened in years. At least, nothing the town still remembered. Ethan jogged toward the small creek that cut across the back edge of the field. Rust followed closely, checking the wind every few seconds, ears twitching. Ethan filled his chipped mug with cold water, then cupped his hands around it as he ran back, hoping his own body heat would soften the chill. When he reached the shed again, Rust stopped abruptly, letting out a sharp bark that bounced off the thin planks of the walls. Ethan skidded to a halt, water sloshing over his hands. The eggs were moving. All three now. Not violently, not even urgently, but with a steady, unmistakable rhythm, like three separate heartbeats trying to synchronize to the world outside. He set the mug down carefully and dropped to his knees. "Hey," he whispered, his voice barely more than breath. "I'm here." One egg flickered. That was the only word Ethan could think for it. Flickered, like something inside had brushed against a thin wall of light. A small crack appeared, running down its surface like a hairline fracture in ice. Rust whimpered, unsure whether to bolt or stay. "No," Ethan murmured, running a hand down the dog's back. "It's all right. They're just being born." Born. The word settled strangely on his tongue. He didn't know if it was true, or if hatching was something else entirely, for whatever lived inside these shells. But the moment felt like a beginning. A strange, impossible beginning. The second egg cracked, then the third. Far out in the field. Wind rushed over the grass, sending it rippling like a quiet sea. Ethan leaned close, heart hammering. A sound emerged from the smallest egg. Not a chirp, not a squeak. Something softer, higher, almost like a question carried through a reed flute. Ethan swallowed. "I hear you," he whispered. The smallest egg cracked again. A thin line split across the surface, widening slowly as something inside pressed outward. Then, with a soft, wet pop, the shell broke, tiny shards falling into the folds of the blanket. Something emerged. Ethan drew in a sharp breath. Rust whined, backing up a step, tail uncertain but wagging once in disbelief. The creature inside wasn't a bird. It wasn't anything Ethan had seen in textbooks, or on TV screens playing in diners, or in the dog-eared magazines he'd found in waiting rooms years ago. It was delicate, barely larger than Ethan's palm, its skin translucent like wet parchment stretched over fragile bones. Its eyes were closed, its breaths shallow but steady. A pair of small curved wings clung to its sides, folded tight, not feathered but covered in soft, down-like fibers that shimmered faintly as if catching light from nowhere. Ethan's throat tightened. "What are you?" he whispered, voice shaking. The creature shivered. Not from cold, from effort. It pushed its tiny head upward, mouth opening in a thin, trembling gasp. Ethan slid his hands under it instinctively, lifting it gently. It weighed almost nothing. Warm, trembling, impossibly alive. Rust edged closer, sniffing carefully, nose brushing Ethan's wrist. Ethan felt the creature's warmth radiate against his palms. It was like holding a flame that wouldn't burn him. The second egg broke then, sending another shower of pale fragments across the blanket. Ethan set the first creature onto his jacket, nestling it in one sleeve, and reached for the next as it pushed itself free of its shell. This one was slightly larger, its wings longer, its skin a deeper tone. Its eyes flickered open for a heartbeat, opaque, a strange pearlescent shade, before closing again. The third egg hatched minutes later, producing a creature smaller than the others, limbs trembling with every breath. Ethan sat back, hands shaking. 3 of them. 3 impossible lives nestled in the shed beside him. 3 creatures he couldn't identify, whose existence felt like a secret whispered directly into his chest. Rust nudged one gently with his nose, then looked at Ethan with the expression dogs reserve for moments when humans are clearly overwhelmed. Yeah, Ethan murmured. I know. This is insane. But then one of the creatures chirped. Soft, tentative, a fragile sound that tugged something loose in Ethan's chest. He felt his breath shudder. A warmth spread through him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of being needed, not pitied, not looked down on, needed. He reached out, brushing a finger across the smallest creature's back. It leaned into the touch, tiny chest rising and falling against his palm. Okay, he whispered. I guess you're mine now. Rust huffed approvingly. Ethan laughed, a startled, shaky laugh he didn't recognize as his own. The creatures snuggled closer together, curling into the folds of his jacket like nests of light. They were beautiful, strange, and utterly defenseless. He knew the town would not accept this. He barely survived there with a dog. With 3 unknown creatures? They'd call animal control. They'd take them, cage them, study them, fear them, because anything different was a threat, especially in towns as small as this one. Ethan looked around the shed, the thin walls, the hole in the roof, the cold creeping steadily across the dirt floor. This place wasn't safe either. We can't stay here forever, he murmured. The creatures stirred, responding to his voice, tiny limbs stretching. Rust leaned closer, licking the air just above them. We need something better. Somewhere better. He didn't even know where, but he knew what coming back to this shed tomorrow would look like. Rain soaking the ground, cold seeping deeper, creatures shivering, helpless. They wouldn't survive here. He packed slowly, carefully. He tucked the creatures into his jacket, creating a soft cradle between the layers, pulling the zipper just enough to keep them warm, but loose enough that they could breathe. They settled immediately, the smallest one pressing its face into the fabric near his heart. Ethan felt that small warmth against him, steady and trusting. The feeling made his throat hurt. He slung his backpack over his shoulder, whistled softly for Rust, and stepped outside. The field lay wide and gray, wind brushing against the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, someone slammed a door, a faint echo from the town. Ethan looked toward it, toward the life that had never been his, toward people who would never believe what he carried under his jacket. The creatures stirred again, as if pushing him forward. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." He walked, past the cottonwoods, past the fence line, past the place where the field ended and the road began. Rust trotted at his heels, head low, eyes watchful. The sky hung heavy but open, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt that the world wasn't closing in on him. It was opening, not wide, not safely, but enough. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing with a certainty that settled into him like warmth against cold. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't meant to die in a forgotten field. And he wasn't going to let them. The road stretched ahead. Rust pressed against his leg. The creatures breathed softly under his jacket. Ethan took a slow breath, the morning air filling his lung with something that almost felt like hope. "Let's go," he whispered to all of them at once, and together, boy, dog, and 3 impossible lives, they walked into the uncertain day, toward a world that would never believe what they had seen, and toward a future that would change them all, whether it wanted to or not.